In the basement archives of the Millbrook Hollow Historical Society, beneath layers of dust and decades of institutional neglect, lies a collection of documents that defies easy categorization. Filed between mundane property transfers and routine census records, these papers tell a story that challenges our understanding of family, tradition, and the lengths to which human beings will go to preserve what they believe is sacred. The documents in question are the estate records of the Coldwell family, a lineage that occupied the same Victorian mansion on Hollow Creek Road for 116 years. At first glance, the records appear unremarkable: deeds, wills, tax assessments, the standard paperwork of generational wealth transfer. But buried within the legal language is a clause that appears in every Coldwell will from 1847 to 1963, a stipulation that grows more disturbing with each reading. The family bed, being the sacred foundation of our bloodline, shall be shared by all direct descendants as long as breath remains in their bodies. No Coldwell shall sleep apart from the arrangement, for in unity of rest lies unity of purpose, and in unity of purpose lies the preservation of our eternal bond. These words, written in the careful script of Ezekiel Coldwell in 1847, would govern 4 generations of his descendants. They would shape lives, stunt growth, and ultimately claim souls in ways that the original patriarch could never have foreseen. The bed itself, described in insurance documents as a custom mahogany construction measuring 12 feet by 8 feet, was commissioned specifically for this purpose. Local craftsmen's receipts, preserved in the Historical Society's files, detail the unusual specifications: reinforced joints to support multiple occupants, intricate carved headboard featuring intertwining family trees, and side rails extended to prevent falls during restless nights. But it was the testimonies of neighbors collected over the decades by curious townspeople and documented in letters, diary entries, and newspaper clippings that revealed the true scope of the arrangement. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, who lived across Hollow Creek Road from 1923 to 1958, kept a meticulous journal of her observations. Her entries, donated to the Historical Society by her granddaughter, paint a picture of nocturnal vigils that became increasingly disturbing over time. Each evening at precisely 9 o'clock, she wrote in 1924, the upstairs window of the Coldwell house would glow with lamplight, and one by one, the silhouettes would appear. First the parents, then the children, arranging themselves in what appeared to be predetermined positions. By 9:30, all movement would cease, and the house would settle into a silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound from the very air around it. Other neighbors reported similar observations. The postman noted that mail delivery to the Coldwell house required special timing, never before 10 in the morning, as the family remained sequestered in their sleeping chamber well past dawn. Delivery drivers described an eerie stillness that seemed to emanate from the house itself, as if the building held its breath in permanent anticipation. The arrangement wasn't merely about sleep. Town records show that Coldwell children rarely attended school past the age of 12. Property tax assessments reveal no separate bedrooms in the house, only the single, massive sleeping chamber that dominated the second floor. Medical records, when they exist at all, describe a family that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight, neither fully awake nor completely at rest. Dr. Samuel Hartwick, who served as the town's physician from 1889 to 1921, left behind case notes that reference the Coldwells with increasing frequency and concern. His observations, written in the clinical language of his era, nonetheless convey a growing unease with what he witnessed during his rare house calls to Hollow Creek Road. The family presents as a single organism, he wrote in 1903, with individual members displaying symptoms of prolonged sleep deprivation despite claiming adequate rest. There is an unnaturally intimate awareness among family members. Children respond to parental thoughts before they are spoken. Siblings mirror each other's movements without conscious intent. Most disturbing is their collective reaction to any suggestion of separate sleeping arrangements. The fear in their eyes suggests they view such separation not as privacy, but as a form of death. The arrangement persisted through marriages, births, and deaths. When Coldwell children married, their spouses were expected to join the family bed. When children were born, they were placed immediately into the arrangement, their tiny forms nestled among the larger bodies of their relatives. And when death came, as it inevitably did, there is evidence to suggest that even this ultimate separation was not always permanent. Census records from 1920, 1930, and 1940 show discrepancies in the number of living Coldwell family members versus the number of figures neighbors reported lying in the upstairs window. Death certificates exist for several family members, yet eyewitness accounts continue to describe their presence in the nightly arrangement. These inconsistencies, initially dismissed as clerical errors or neighbor confusion, form a pattern too persistent to ignore. The house itself seemed to reflect the weight of this strange tradition. Property assessments note an unusual degree of structural stress in the second floor, as if the building was slowly succumbing to some invisible burden. The floorboards in the master bedroom showed wear patterns inconsistent with normal foot traffic, deep grooves that seemed to emanate outward from the bed's position, as if generations of occupants had worn pathways in the wood through restless movement during endless nights. Perhaps most telling are the financial records that show the Coldwell family's gradual withdrawal from normal commerce and social interaction. Business receipts become increasingly sparse after 1890. Social correspondence dwindles to nothing by 1900. By 1920, the family had become essentially self-sufficient, ordering supplies in bulk and interacting with the outside world only when absolutely necessary. The arrangement that began as Ezekiel Coldwell's vision of family unity had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing, a system that preserved the family by slowly consuming its individual members, creating a collective entity that existed in the liminal space between sleep and waking, between life and something that merely resembled it. As we delve deeper into the Coldwell legacy, we begin to understand that this was not simply an eccentric family tradition, but a carefully constructed prison that trapped 4 generations in an eternal embrace from which there was no escape save death, and perhaps not even then. To understand the full weight of what would befall the Coldwell lineage, we must return to its origins in the autumn of 1847, when Ezekiel Coldwell first set foot in Millbrook Hollow with his pregnant wife Sarah in a wagon containing their most precious possession, a mahogany bed of unusual proportions and disturbing beauty. Ezekiel arrived in town with considerable wealth, though its sources remained deliberately obscured. Town records show he purchased the largest lot available on Hollow Creek Road and immediately commissioned the construction of a mansion designed around very specific requirements. The architectural plans, preserved in the building permit files, revealed a structure that prioritized one room above all others, a second-floor sleeping chamber that occupied nearly half of the house's total square footage. Local craftsmen who worked on the project left behind accounts that suggest Ezekiel's vision was both precise and unsettling. Carpenter Thomas Whitmore wrote to his brother that the client insisted on reinforcing the floor joists far beyond normal specifications, claiming the room would need to support the weight of generations. The plastering crew reported instructions to create acoustics that would muffle sound within the room while amplifying whispers, a design that would allow the softest conversations to be heard by all occupants while preventing outside eavesdropping. But it was the bed itself that revealed the true nature of Ezekiel's intentions. Shipped from a craftsman in Salem whose name appears nowhere else in local records, the piece arrived in sections that required 3 days to assemble. Witnesses described elaborate joinery that seemed to defy conventional furniture construction, with carved elements that created a maze-like pattern across the headboard and footboard. Most unsettling were the inscriptions, etched in Latin along the bed. This perimeter. Sanguis ad sanguinum, somnus ad aeternum, blood to blood, sleep unto eternity. Sarah Coldwell, heavily pregnant upon their arrival, gave birth to twins within a month of settling into the mansion. The birth, attended by the town's midwife, resulted in complications that would define the family's relationship with the outside world. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, the midwife, left behind a detailed account in her personal journal, describing a delivery that defied her 40 years of experience. The mother labored in perfect silence, she wrote, though her pain was evident. But most strange was the father's behavior. He insisted on remaining in the room, positioned at the head of the great bed, his hands pressed against his wife's temples throughout the delivery. The babies, when they came, made no sound, not the usual cries of new life, but an eerie silence that filled the room with dread. When I placed them in their mother's arms, they arranged themselves as if they had been practicing this positioning for months in the womb, each finding their exact place without guidance. The twins, named Matthias and Magdalene, would be the first of 6 children born to Ezekiel and Sarah, and each birth followed the same unnatural pattern. The children emerged silent, seeming to possess an instinctive understanding of their role in the family arrangement. By 1855, the Coldwell bed accommodated 8 individuals, from Ezekiel and Sarah in the center to the youngest infant nestled against its mother's side. Church records from this period reveal Ezekiel's growing influence within the community, though his religious views diverged significantly from traditional Protestant doctrine. Reverend Marcus Hale's personal correspondence, discovered in the church archives, describes theological discussions with Ezekiel that grew increasingly uncomfortable over time. He speaks of family as a singular soul housed in multiple forms, Reverend Hale wrote to a colleague in 1851. His belief is that physical proximity, specifically shared sleep, allows for the communion of spirits that transcends individual identity. He quotes scripture, but interprets it in ways that suggest dangerous thinking. Most concerning is his conviction that death need not sever these spiritual bonds if the proper arrangements are maintained. This philosophy manifested in the household's daily routines, which became increasingly rigid as the children grew. Former servants, interviewed decades later by local historians, described a home where individual privacy was considered a form of spiritual corruption. Children were discouraged from forming exclusive friendships, pursuing individual interests, or expressing preferences that might distinguish them from their siblings. Martha Goodwin, who worked as a housemaid from 1852 to 1857, provided the most detailed account of life within the Coldwell household. Her testimony, recorded in 1923 when she was 89 years old, offers a glimpse into the psychological mechanisms that sustained the arrangement. The children moved as one mind, she recalled. If young Matthias felt hunger, all the siblings would request food. If Magdalene showed signs of fatigue, the entire family would retire to their chamber. Most disturbing was their reaction to any task that required individual effort. The youngest ones would weep inconsolably if asked to play alone, while the older children would develop physical symptoms, fever, trembling, even temporary blindness, when separated from their siblings for more than an hour. The servant quarters, located in the mansion's basement, were positioned directly below the family sleeping chamber. Martha and other domestic staff reported nightly disturbances that defied explanation. The sound of movement far exceeding what 8 people could produce, whispered conversations that seemed to involve more voices than there were family members, and occasional periods of absolute silence so complete that the staff wondered if the family had simply vanished. By 1860, the Coldwell children had become virtually invisible to the outside community. School attendance records show that none of the children attended classes beyond the age of 12, with Ezekiel claiming to provide private education within the home. However, no tutors were ever seen entering or leaving the mansion, and correspondence with educational authorities suggests that the children's learning was limited to subjects that served the family's internal needs: basic mathematics for household management, reading restricted to religious and philosophical texts chosen by their father, and writing skills used primarily for maintaining family records. The isolation deepened with each passing year. Business associates noted that Ezekiel's meetings increasingly took place in the mansion's ground floor study rather than in town offices. Social invitations were politely declined, with Sarah citing the children's delicate constitutions as requiring constant supervision. Even medical care became increasingly rare, with Dr. Hartwick making house calls only during genuine emergencies. Most telling were the financial arrangements that Ezekiel put in place to ensure the continuation of his vision. His will, drafted in 1862, established a trust that would provide for his descendants in perpetuity, but only as long as they maintained the family arrangement. Any Coldwell who chose to sleep apart from the family bed would forfeit their inheritance and be considered legally dead to the estate. The trust document contained additional provisions that revealed the depth of Ezekiel's planning. Funds were allocated for the bed's maintenance and repair, for household supplies to be delivered without requiring family members to venture into town, and for the eventual expansion of the sleeping arrangement as future generations joined the family. Most ominously, the trust included provisions for what Ezekiel termed spiritual maintenance. undefined expenses related to ensuring the continuation of family bonds beyond the physical realm. As we examine these foundational years, a disturbing picture emerges of a man who systematically engineered the destruction of individual identity in service of a collective vision that he believed would transcend mortality itself. The silence that settled over the Coldwell household was not merely the absence of sound, but the elimination of the individual voices that might have questioned the wisdom of such complete surrender to familial unity. The arrangement that Ezekiel created would outlive him by nearly a century, becoming a prison that his descendants could neither escape nor fully comprehend, a legacy that would ultimately consume everything it claimed to preserve. By the 1870s, the true cost of the Coldwell arrangement began to manifest in ways that even Ezekiel's careful planning had not anticipated. The psychological toll of absolute intimacy, of lives lived without the benefit of solitude or individual identity, created a family that existed in a perpetual state of nervous exhaustion disguised as harmonious unity. Dr. Margaret Thornfield arrived in Millbrook Hollow in 1889, one of the first female physicians to practice in rural New England. Her case notes, discovered in 1963 during the demolition of the old medical center, provide the most detailed clinical assessment of the Coldwell family's condition. What she documents challenges our understanding of how human beings can adapt to circumstances that violate the most basic needs for individual space and psychological autonomy. Her first encounter with the family occurred in September 1890 when she was summoned to treat what appeared to be a routine case of influenza affecting multiple family members. What she found at the mansion on Hollow Creek Road defied her medical training and haunted her professional practice for the remainder of her career. "I was escorted to the second-floor sleeping chamber," she wrote in her private journal, and immediately struck by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the room itself. The massive bed dominated the space like an altar, and arranged upon it were 7 individuals ranging in age from infant to adult, all displaying identical symptoms despite the medical impossibility of such synchronized illness. The family's response to her examination revealed behavioral patterns that suggested profound psychological conditioning. When Dr. Thornfield attempted to examine each patient individually, the others would begin to exhibit signs of distress, elevated heart rate, perspiration, and a peculiar form of vocal resonance where they would hum in unison until the separated family member was returned to the group. Most disturbing was their apparent inability to provide individual medical histories, she noted. When questioned about personal symptoms, each family member would defer to the group consensus, as if they had no access to their own physical sensations without collective validation. The children particularly seemed to lack basic self-awareness, unable to distinguish between their own pain and that experienced by their siblings. Dr. Thornfield's subsequent visits revealed a family trapped in what she termed enforced empathy, a psychological state where the boundaries between individual consciousness had become so blurred that separate identity was no longer possible. Her clinical observations documented symptoms that had no precedent in medical literature, synchronized sleep cycles that persisted even when family members were briefly separated, shared dream content reported by multiple individuals, and physical symptoms that would migrate from one family member to another without apparent cause. The sleeping arrangement itself had evolved into a complex ecosystem of human interaction that defied normal understanding of personal space and individual needs. The bed, now showing significant wear after 4 decades of constant occupation, bore the physical evidence of its unusual purpose. The mattress had developed permanent depressions that corresponded to specific family members, creating a landscape of human-shaped valleys that guided each individual to their designated position each night. "The bed has become a mold," Dr. Thornfield observed, "shaping the occupants as much as they have shaped it. The children particularly seem to have developed physical characteristics that correspond to their sleeping positions. Curved spines from years of accommodation to limited space, shortened limbs from constrained movement, and most concerning, a form of muscular atrophy that suggests their bodies are adapting to permanent recline." The psychological impact was even more profound. Dr. Thornfield's notes describe a family that had developed its own internal language, a combination of whispers, gestures, and shared glances that allowed for communication without disturbing the collective rest. This private vocabulary had evolved to the point where interaction with outsiders required visible effort, as if set, peaking and standard English was a foreign language that demanded conscious translation. Sleep itself had become a communal activity that bore little resemblance to normal human rest patterns. Rather than the individual cycles of sleep and waking that characterize healthy human behavior, the Coldwell family had developed what Dr. Thornfield termed collective consciousness, a state where sleep and waking occurred in synchronized waves across all family members, creating periods of group dream states and shared nocturnal experiences. "I observed them during one of my evening visits," she recorded, and was struck by the unnatural synchronization of their breathing, their movements, even their facial expressions during sleep. It was as if watching a single organism with multiple manifestations rather than a collection of individual human beings. Most disturbing were the moments when all would suddenly shift positions simultaneously, adjusting their arrangement with a precision that suggested external guidance or a collective instinct that transcends normal human behavior. The physical environment of the sleeping chamber had adapted to accommodate this unusual lifestyle. Windows were kept permanently curtained to maintain consistent lighting. The temperature was carefully regulated through a complex system of ventilation that Ezekiel had designed to ensure optimal comfort for multiple occupants. Most notably, all timepieces had been removed from the room, creating a temporal bubble where the normal rhythms of day and night ceased to govern the family's activities. Children born into this arrangement showed signs of developmental delays that seemed specifically related to their inability to form individual identity. Dr. Thornfield's notes describe infants who would cease crying only when returned to the family bed, children who could not sleep unless surrounded by their relatives, and adolescents who displayed physical symptoms of distress when expected to make independent decisions. "The youngest Coldwell child," she wrote in 1892, "displays intelligence and awareness appropriate to her age, yet seems incapable of functioning as an individual entity. When presented with choices, simple preferences about food or play, she exhibits what can only be described as existential panic, as if the concept of individual desire is incomprehensible to her developing mind." Perhaps most concerning were Dr. Thornfield's observations about the family's relationship with time and mortality. The constant proximity seemed to have created a distorted sense of temporal progression, where individual aging became secondary to collective experience. Family members appeared to age at different rates, with some showing premature signs of physical decline, while others seemed suspended in developmental states inappropriate to their chronological age. The arrangement had created its own gravity, drawing all family members into an orbit from which escape seemed impossible. As Dr. Thornfield noted in her final assessment of the family, "They have created a closed system that sustains itself through the complete absorption of individual identity. The tragedy is not merely that they cannot leave, but that they can no longer conceive of existence outside the arrangement. They have become prisoners of their own perfected intimacy." The weight of such absolute proximity was slowly crushing the very humanity it claimed to preserve, creating a family that existed in a state between life and something altogether more disturbing. The most haunting aspect of the Coldwell legacy emerges not from what we can document, but from the spaces between documentation, the children whose lives seem to have been carefully erased from official records, while their presence lingered in ways that challenge our understanding of what it means to exist within a family. School attendance records from the mill. Brook Hollow Elementary School tell a story of systematic withdrawal that becomes more disturbing with each generation. The pattern was consistent. Coldwell children would attend classes regularly until approximately age 12, at which point their attendance would become sporadic before ceasing entirely. Teachers' notes describe bright, alert children who nonetheless seemed unable to function independently, always seeking the proximity of siblings and displaying signs of severe anxiety when separated from family members even during school hours. Miss Catherine Winters, who taught at the elementary school from 1885 to 1920, left behind detailed observations in her personal teaching journal. Her entries regarding the Coldwell children reveal a growing concern that she felt powerless to address within the social constraints of her era. Young Eleanor Coldwell, she wrote in 1914, possesses a quick mind and gentle disposition, yet there is something profoundly unsettling about her demeanor. She speaks in whispers, as if afraid to disturb some invisible presence, and her essays, while beautifully written, all focus on themes of family unity and the dangers of individual ambition. Most concerning is her apparent inability to imagine a future that extends beyond the family home. When asked about her aspirations, she simply states that her purpose is to serve the arrangement, as if this phrase holds meaning that requires no further explanation. The truancy officers who occasionally investigated the Coldwell family's educational compliance found themselves confronting a situation that defied the legal frameworks of their time. Parents had the right to provide private education, and the Coldwell children, when examined, demonstrated literacy and basic mathematical skills that technically satisfied legal requirements. However, the content of their education revealed a curriculum designed not to prepare them for independent adult life, but to reinforce their role within the family structure. Writing samples preserved in the school district archives show a disturbing progression in the children's worldview across generations. Early essays from the 1880s, while unusual in their focus on family loyalty, still contain references to individual hopes and interests. By the 1900s, such personal references had largely disappeared, replaced by philosophical meditations on the nature of collective identity and the spiritual benefits of shared existence. Eleanor Coldwell's diary, discovered within the walls of the mansion during its demolition, provides the most intimate glimpse into the psychology of a child raised within the arrangement. Her entries, spanning from age 10 to her final entry at age 16, document the gradual erosion of individual consciousness in language that is both beautiful and deeply disturbing. "Mother explained to me today why we cannot sleep apart," she wrote in 1912. "She says that when we are together in the bed, our dreams join and become stronger. She says that alone, we are just fragments of a greater whole, but together we become complete. I tried to imagine sleeping by myself, but the thought makes my chest feel hollow, as if important parts of me would simply disappear into the darkness." As Eleanor matured, her entries revealed an awareness of her situation that made her captivity even more tragic. She understood that her life was different from other children, yet she had been so thoroughly conditioned to view this difference as superiority rather than deprivation that escape seemed not merely impossible, but spiritually dangerous. "I watched the Morrison children playing in their yard today," she wrote in 1914, "and felt both pity and fear for them. They seemed so isolated from each other, so alone in their individual bodies. How do they bear the loneliness? How do they sleep without feeling the comfort of family breath and heartbeat surrounding them? I think they must be very brave or very foolish to live such separate lives." The physical evidence of these vanished children exists in fragments scattered throughout the mansion's remains. Personal belongings that suggest individual personalities, a hand-carved wooden horse, a collection of pressed flowers, a small leather-bound book of poetry. Yet none of these items appear in household inventories or insurance records, as if they had been deliberately excluded from official documentation. Photographs present perhaps the most unsettling evidence of the children's gradual disappearance from normal life. Family portraits from the 1880s show the Coldwell children with expressions and postures similar to other children of their era. By the 1900s, however, their faces had acquired a uniform quality, serene but vacant, as if they were looking at something beyond the camera's range that was invisible to ordinary perception. Most disturbing are the later photographs that show what appears to be more children than could be accounted for by birth records. A family portrait from 1920 clearly shows 9 figures arranged around the famous bed, yet genealogical research indicates that only 6 family members were alive at that time. The additional figures are slightly out of focus, as if movement or perhaps something more fundamental prevented them from being captured clearly by the camera's lens. The mansion's servants, who lived in the basement quarters directly below the family sleeping chamber, provided testimonies that suggested the children's presence persisted even after their official disappearance from public records. Martha Goodwin's granddaughter, interviewed in 1963, recalled stories her grandmother had shared about the sounds from upstairs. Footsteps that seemed to belong to more individuals than the household could account for, voices that continued conversations long after the documented family members had retired to sleep. "Grandmother always said there were more children in that house than anyone admitted," the granddaughter recalled. She'd hear them at night moving around upstairs, talking in whispers. Sometimes she'd count the voices and come up with numbers that didn't match the families she served meals to during the day. When she asked about it, Mrs. Coldwell would just smile and say that love keeps everyone close, even when they seem far away. Dr. Thornfield's medical records contain references to examining children who do not appear in any other documentation. Her notes from 1895 mention treating a boy named Thomas for a respiratory ailment, yet no Thomas Coldwell appears in birth records, census data, or any other official documents. When she later inquired about the child's recovery, the family seemed confused by her questions, as if the boy had never existed. The psychological implications of this systematic erasure become even more disturbing when viewed through the lens of Eleanor's diary entries. Her later writings suggest an awareness that some family members existed in a state between presence and absence, contributing to the family's collective consciousness while remaining invisible to the outside world. "I understand now why some of us fade while others remain visible," she wrote in her final entry, dated March 1916. "The arrangement requires different kinds of service. Some of us must interact with the world beyond our walls, while others serve by remaining constant within the bed, holding space for those who must venture out. We are all equally important, whether we cast shadows or exist in the spaces between shadows. The bed holds us all, and we hold the bed, and in this holding, we become eternal." The tragedy of the Coldwell children lies not merely in their physical captivity, but in their psychological transformation into something that was no longer quite human, yet remained desperately, lovingly devoted to their family. They had become guardians of an arrangement that consumed their individual lives while promising them a form of immortality that may have been more prison than paradise. Their disappearance from official records represents not death, but a more profound form of erasure, the gradual absorption of individual identity into a collective entity that preserved their essential selves while eliminating everything that made them unique. They became, in Eleanor's words, fragments of love made permanent. The boundary between life and death, always thin within the Coldwell household, became virtually non-existent as the decades passed. Neighbors' accounts from the 1920s through the 1950s describe a phenomenon that challenged the rational understanding of mortality itself. The persistent presence of family members who had, according to official records, passed away years or even decades earlier. Mrs. Abigail Thornton's observations, recorded in her meticulous daily journal, provide the most comprehensive documentation of these impossible sightings. Her position across Hollow Creek Road afforded her an unobstructed view of the Coldwell mansion's second-floor window, and her record-keeping reveals a pattern that becomes increasingly disturbing as the years progress. October 15, 1924, she wrote, "The evening arrangement appears to include more figures than I counted during daylight hours. I observed 7 distinct silhouettes against the lamplight, yet I am certain that only 5 Coldwells attended church services this past Sunday. Most concerning is the presence of what appears to be a small child in the window's left corner, a position that matches exactly where young Matthias used to sleep before his passing in 1918. Matthias Coldwell's death certificate, filed with the county clerk in November 1918, lists pneumonia as the cause of death. Funeral arrangements were handled privately by the family, with burial taking place in the Coldwell family plot at Millbrook Cemetery. Yet Mrs. Thornton's subsequent entries consistently reference a child-sized figure in the window, always positioned in what she had identified as Matthias's traditional sleeping place. The postal worker, Henry Fisher, who served the Hollow Creek Road route from 1920 to 1945, provided testimony that corroborated these observations. His daily rounds required him to pass the Coldwell mansion each morning at approximately 10:30, and his informal notes, kept in the margins of his delivery logs, document sightings that defied logical explanation. Mail delivery, October 22, 1924, he noted, all windows dark except the big upstairs room, counted at least 8 figures visible against the curtains, though death notices in my bag indicate that the old man Ezekiel passed last month, still appears to be occupying his spot at the window's center. Makes a man wonder about the nature of final rest. These observations might be dismissed as tricks of light or wishful thinking, except for their consistency across multiple witnesses and their remarkable specificity. The watchers in the window maintained the same positions, night after night, year after year, as if death had not altered their participation in the family arrangement but had merely rendered them invisible to casual observation. Dr. James Whitlock, who assumed medical care for the Coldwell family after Dr. Thornfield's retirement, encountered this phenomenon directly during a house call in 1928. His professional notes, discovered in his estate papers, describe an experience that shook his medical rationalism to its foundation. Called to attend Mrs. Sarah Coldwell for what the family described as a recurring fever, he wrote, "Upon entering the sleeping chamber, I was immediately struck by the sensation of additional presence, shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, slight depressions in the bed's surface that suggested more occupants than I could see." Most disturbing was Mrs. Coldwell's apparent interaction with invisible individuals, adjusting her position to accommodate what appeared to be empty space, whispering responses to unheard conversations. When Dr. Whitlock questioned the family about these observations, their responses revealed a casual acceptance of circumstances that challenged the fundamental nature of mortality. Eleanor Coldwell, now in her 20s but still occupying her childhood position in the family bed, explained the situation with a matter-of-fact tone that made her words even more unsettling. "Death is just another form of sleep," she told him. "Those who have passed still need their rest, still need their place in the arrangement. We keep their spaces warm, and they keep us company during the long nights. It's not strange, Doctor. It's love continuing beyond the boundaries that others accept as final." Photographic evidence, while limited, provides visual confirmation of these accounts. A series of pictures taken by traveling photographer Marcus Webb in 1931 include several exterior shots of the Coldwell mansion. When examined closely, the upstairs window reveals figures that seem to exist in varying degrees of transparency, some clearly defined against the lamplight, others appearing as subtle variations in shadow that become more apparent with careful study. Webb's personal notes, found among his equipment after his death in 1952, describe his experience photographing the mansion with growing unease. "Took several shots of the house on Hollow Creek Road," he wrote. "Something odd about the upstairs window, kept catching movement in my peripheral vision, but direct observation revealed nothing unusual. The photographs, however, show what my eyes could not detect. There are more people in that house than claim to live there." The phenomenon extended beyond mere visual sightings. Neighbors reported sounds that suggested more occupants than could be accounted for by the living family members. Mrs. Dorothy Hastings, who lived 2 houses down from the Coldwells from 1935 to 1950, described nocturnal disturbances that seemed to emanate from the mansion. "On still nights when the wind wasn't blowing through the trees, you could hear them," she recalled in a 1963 interview. "Voices carrying across the yard, not loud but persistent. Conversations that seemed to involve more people than the family had left. Children's laughter from a house where no children had lived for years. Most unsettling was the singing. Lullabies sung in harmony by voices that ranged from young to old, as if several generations were joining together in some evening ritual." The mailbox at the end of the Coldwell driveway began receiving correspondence addressed to family members who had been dead for decades. Henry Fisher's replacement, Robert Manning, noted this peculiarity in his reports to the postal supervisor. Letters would arrive addressed to Ezekiel Coldwell, Matthias Coldwell, and other deceased family members, often from sources that could not be traced to any legitimate sender. "The return addresses," Manning noted, "either don't exist or lead to empty lots, abandoned buildings, or locations that appear to have been vacant for years." Most disturbing is that these letters are often responses to outgoing correspondence, replies to messages that suggest the dead Coldwells are maintaining active communication with similarly mysterious contacts. Window washers, repair workers, and delivery personnel who had occasion to approach the mansion during daylight hours reported seeing movement behind the upstairs curtains that exceeded what the living occupants could produce. The shadows cast against the fabric suggested a bustling household full of active individuals, yet direct observation of the family during public appearances revealed only the few surviving members moving with the slow, deliberate pace of people carrying invisible burdens. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts of children playing in the mansion's yard during twilight hours, children whose voices could be heard clearly but whose forms remained just beyond clear observation. These young voices would call to each other with names that matched deceased Coldwell children, engaging in games and conversations that suggested their play had continued uninterrupted despite the transition from life to whatever state they now occupied. Mrs. Thornton's final entries regarding the Coldwell house, written in 1958, shortly before her own death, capture the full horror of what she had observed for over 3 decades. "The watchers in the window have multiplied," she wrote. "What began as occasional glimpses of the departed has become a full congregation of souls who refuse to abandon their posts. The window glows each night with a light that seems to come from within the occupants themselves rather than from any earthly lamp. I count 12, sometimes 13 figures now, spanning generations of Coldwells who have chosen to remain bound to their earthly arrangement rather than accept the separation that death traditionally provides. They watch our town with eyes that have seen beyond the veil, yet choose to look backward toward the lives they refuse to release." The watchers in the window had become guardians of something far more complex than family tradition. They had become the eternal custodians of an arrangement that had transcended the normal boundaries of human existence, creating a liminal space where love and obsession had merged into something that could neither live nor die, but could only perpetually observe and remember. In the winter of 1959, 16-year-old Isadora Coldwell inherited more than a family fortune. She became the sole living custodian of an arrangement that had consumed 4 generations of her bloodline. The last surviving member of a family that had systematically erased the boundary between individual identity and collective existence, Isadora found herself sharing the massive mahogany bed not merely with memories, but with the persistent presence of relatives who had refused to accept the finality of death. Her correspondence with a distant cousin, Margaret Coldwell Hayes of Boston, provides the most intimate documentation of those final 4 years. The letters, discovered in Margaret's estate papers in 1987, reveal a young woman struggling to maintain her sanity while fulfilling obligations that no human being should be expected to bear. "Dear Marga, Rhett," she wrote in February 1960, "I know you think I should leave this place, start fresh somewhere new, but you cannot understand the weight of what I carry. They are still here, all of them. Father, mother, the little ones who passed so young, even great-grandfather Ezekiel who began this arrangement more than a century ago. They need me to maintain their places, to keep the bed warm for them, to ensure that the family bonds remain unbroken even in death." The physical toll of her situation becomes apparent in medical records from Dr. Harrison Mills, who provided what little health care Isadora would accept during these years. His notes describe a patient exhibiting severe sleep deprivation despite claiming to rest for 12 hours each night, dramatic weight loss despite adequate nutrition, and psychological symptoms that suggested she was responding to stimuli invisible to outside observation. Patient claims to sleep surrounded by deceased family members, Dr. Mills recorded in 1961. Describes detailed conversations with the dead, adjusts her physical position throughout the night to accommodate invisible bedmates, and shows signs of extreme distress when suggestions are made about alternative sleeping arrangements. Most concerning is her apparent belief that leaving the family bed would result in the spiritual abandonment of relatives who depend on her presence for their continued existence. Isadora's letters reveal that she had developed an acute sensitivity to the presence of her deceased family members that went beyond simple hallucination or wishful thinking. She described physical sensations, the weight of invisible bodies, the warmth of breath from mouths that no longer drew air, the gentle pressure of hands that had turned to dust decades earlier, with a specificity that suggested either genuine supernatural experience or a complete psychological breakthrough. In reality, last night, little Matthias was restless, she wrote in March 1961. He has been unsettled since the winter storms began, and his movements disturbed the others. I had to sing him the lullaby that Mother used to sing, the one about the family tree that grows strongest when all its branches intertwine. It took hours before he settled, and by then Eleanor was whispering about changes coming, about the arrangement needing protection that I might not be able to provide. The mansion itself began to deteriorate rapidly during Isadora's final years, as if the building could no longer sustain the supernatural weight it had been designed to contain. Property assessment records from 1962 note structural damage that exceeded normal wear. Floorboards in the second-floor sleeping chamber had begun to sag despite recent reinforcement, wallpaper peeled in patterns that resembled human silhouettes, and the temperature in the house fluctuated wildly without regard to the heating system settings. Isadora's awareness of her own psychological state fluctuated between lucid recognition of her circumstances and complete immersion in the family mythology that had shaped her entire existence. Her letters during 1962 reveal a young woman desperately seeking a solution to an impossible situation. "I have been researching our family's history," she wrote to Margaret in September 1962, "trying to understand how this arrangement began and whether there might be a way to release us all from its bonds." Great-grandfather's papers speak of the bed as a sacred vessel designed to contain the spiritual essence of our bloodline across generations. But I fear that what he created was not preservation, but imprisonment, a beautiful trap that has held us captive for over a century. Her investigation into the family's origins led her to discoveries that filled her with both hope and terror. Hidden compartment. In Ezekiel's desk contained correspondence with individuals whose names appeared in no standard historical records, letters discussing spiritual practices that blended Christian mysticism with older, darker traditions that seemed designed to bind souls to physical locations. "I found the original plans for the bed," she wrote in her final letter to Margaret, dated January 15, 1963. "It was not simply commissioned from a craftsman, but designed according to specifications that come from sources I dare not name. The wood was treated with substances that I cannot identify, the joints were sealed with materials that seemed to resist normal decay, and the inscriptions were carved according to patterns that hurt my eyes to examine closely. Most disturbing are the notes in great-grandfather's hand, describing the bed as a spiritual anchor designed to prevent the family soul from dispersing after death." The realization that the arrangement was not merely tradition but a form of supernatural binding filled Isadora with a determination that had been building throughout her years of solitary guardianship. Her final decisions, documented in a journal discovered in the mansion's ruins, reveal a young woman who chose destruction over the continuation of a legacy that had become a curse. "I understand now what must be done," she wrote in her final entry dated February 28, 1963. "The arrangement cannot be simply abandoned, it must be completely destroyed. The bed, the house, and everything that connects our family to this earthly existence must be consumed by fire. Only then can we be truly free, only then can the dead find their proper rest, and only then can the living cease to be prisoners of love that has become indistinguishable from damnation." The fire that consumed the Coldwell mansion on March 1, 1963, was visible from 3 towns away. Volunteer firefighters arriving at the scene found a blaze that seemed to burn with unusual intensity, consuming the structure with a thoroughness that suggested something more than normal combustion. The heat was so extreme that metal fixtures melted completely, and the fire burned for 3 days despite multiple attempts to extinguish it. Isadora's remains were found in the center of what had been the second-floor sleeping chamber, positioned exactly where the great bed had stood for over a century. The coroner's report noted that while the surrounding area had been consumed by flames of extraordinary intensity, her body showed no signs of burning. She appeared to have died peacefully in her sleep, as if the fire had been a gentle release rather than a violent destruction. Most mysteriously, witnesses reported seeing figures moving within the flames during the first night of the fire, not panicked victims seeking escape, but calm silhouettes that seemed to dance within the conflagration, as if celebrating their liberation. The volunteer fire chief, Robert Manning, described seeing what appeared to be an entire family holding hands within the burning structure, their forms visible for brief moments before being consumed by light that seemed to emanate from within their bodies rather than from the surrounding flames. "It was the strangest thing I've ever witnessed," Manning reported to the state fire marshal. "The fire seemed almost alive, almost purposeful. It consumed everything connected to the family's presence, but left the surrounding trees and outbuildings completely untouched. Most unsettling were the sounds, not screaming or the normal sounds of destruction, but what sounded like singing, like multiple voices joined in harmony as the building came down around them. The insurance investigation found no evidence of arson or mechanical failure that could account for the fire's unusual characteristics. The official report classified the incident as accidental destruction due to unknown ignition source, but unofficial accounts from investigators suggested that the fire had displayed properties that challenged their understanding of normal combustion. In the weeks following the fire, neighbors reported that the area around the former Coldwell property had acquired a sense of profound peace that had been absent for decades. The oppressive atmosphere that had surrounded the mansion for generations had lifted, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of a long burden finally released. Isadora Coldwell had succeeded where 4 generations of her ancestors had failed. She had broken the arrangement not through abandonment, which would have left the spiritual bonds intact, but through complete sacrifice, choosing to join her family in death rather than condemn them to eternal imprisonment within the confines of earthly love. The empty lot on Hollow Creek Road where the Coldwell mansion once stood remains unsold and undeveloped more than 60 years after the fire that consumed both the family and their ancestral burden. Local real estate records show that the property has been listed numerous times, yet no sale has ever been completed. Prospective buyers consistently withdraw their offers after visiting the site, citing vague discomfort or practical concerns that seem insufficient to explain their unanimous reluctance to build upon the land. Margaret Coldwell Hayes, Isadora's distant cousin and the sole heir to the Coldwell estate, made several attempts to develop the property during the 1970s. Her correspondence with local contractors reveals a pattern of inexplicable construction difficulties that ultimately forced her to abandon all development plans. Foundation work would inexplicably fail, with concrete refusing to set properly despite ideal weather conditions. Equipment would malfunction without apparent cause, and workers would report feeling watched by invisible observers who seemed to disapprove of any attempt to disturb the site. "The strangest thing," wrote contractor James Morrison in 1974, "is how the earth itself seems to resist our efforts. We've tried 3 times to lay a proper foundation, but each attempt results in settling patterns that make no geological sense. The soil samples show nothing unusual, yet something is preventing normal construction. The workers are getting spooked. They claim to hear voices coming from underground, children singing lullabies just below the threshold of clear hearing." The town of Millbrook Hollow has developed its own relationship with the empty lot, one that speaks to humanity's complex relationship with tragedy and the supernatural. The site has become an unofficial memorial, not to the Coldwell family specifically, but to the broader questions their story raises about the nature of love, family, and the price of absolute devotion. Local historians, led by the current curator of the Millbrook Hollow Historical Society, have attempted to preserve the factual record of the Coldwell family while acknowledging the elements of their story that resist rational explanation. The official historical marker, installed in 1983, reads simply, "Site of the Coldwell family home, 1847 to 1963, a reminder that love, taken to extremes, can become its own form of captivity." The marker's deliberately ambiguous language reflects the community's struggle to process a legacy that challenges comfortable assumptions about family bonds and individual autonomy. Town council meetings from the 1980s reveal lengthy debates about how to memorialize a family whose story serves as both cautionary tale and inexplicable mystery. Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of psychology at the nearby State University, has studied the Coldwell case as part of her research into extreme family dynamics. Her 1995 paper, Collective Identity and Individual Dissolution, The Coldwell Family as a Case Study in Pathological Intimacy, provides the most comprehensive academic analysis of the family's psychological trajectory. What the Coldwell family created, Dr. Chen writes, was a closed system that sustained itself by consuming the individual identities of its members. The tragedy lies not merely in the obvious psychological damage, but in the family's sincere belief that they were preserving something sacred. Their love was genuine, but it had become so concentrated, so turned inward upon itself, that it ceased to nourish and began to devour. The broader implications of the Coldwell story continue to resonate within contemporary discussions of family dynamics, personal autonomy, and the balance between collective responsibility and individual rights. Support groups for adults recovering from enmeshed family systems have adopted elements of the Coldwell story as a metaphor for the ways that love can become indistinguishable from control, and devotion can mask psychological imprisonment. Yet questions remain that resist both psychological analysis and rational explanation. The testimonies of multiple witnesses, the photographic evidence of impossible occupancy, and the supernatural elements that surrounded the family's final years create a narrative that exists at the intersection of documented history and inexplicable phenomena. Perhaps most significantly, the Coldwell story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of family bonds and the extent to which love can justify the erosion of individual identity. In an era that increasingly values personal autonomy and individual self-actualization, the Coldwell family's complete surrender to collective identity serves as both cautionary tale and philosophical challenge. The empty lot continues to resist development, as if the earth itself remembers what transpired there and refuses to support new construction. Neighbors report that the area maintains an unusual quality of silence, not merely the absence of sound but a deeper quiet that seems to absorb noise from the surrounding environment. On certain evenings, particularly during the winter months when Isadora made her final choice, visitors to the site report a sense of profound peace mixed with ineffable sadness, the emotional residue of a love so complete it became imprisonment, and a sacrifice so total it achieved the liberation that 4 generations had sought but never found. The ashes of the Coldwell legacy remind us that some stories resist neat conclusions, leaving us instead with questions that illuminate the complex territory between devotion and destruction, between the bonds that sustain us and the chains that we mistake for embrace.